Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everyone to our seventh session in the Microsoft AI chat app hack. Today we are joined again by Matt. Do you want to introduce yourself, Matt?
Hi, folks. My name is Matt. I'm a program manager on Azure AI Search. Looking forward to talking with you guys today about access control.
All right, and Matt last talked to us about GPT-4 vision. So if you missed that, go back and watch that recording. It was really, really fun. And I'm Pamela. I'm on the Python Cloud Advocacy team and also one of the maintainers of the RAG chat repo that we've been hacking on and showing lots of stuff in, and that Matt will be showing again today. So for those of you just joining us, we are running this hackathon for 2 weeks to build AI RAG chat apps so that you can combine a LLM with your own data so that you can create like these kind of custom, custom GPT, custom co-pilot like experiences. And we've already had a whole week of sessions and talks and hacking. And then we have this week coming up with more talks, more hacking. And so we'd love to see more of you, coming to the talks and also registering for the hackathon. And when you're done, submitting your project so we can check out the cool things that people are making. So now I'm going to hand it over to Matt to talk about access control for your RAG chat apps.
Thanks so much for the intro, Pamela. Hi, folks. So as we talked about, we're talking about access control. So in a word, it's super interesting because we're not talking about something that's just unique to RAG applications, right? Any production you put in the application, you run into this problem where, hey, do I really want everybody on the internet to be able to use my app? It gets a little more complicated with RAG apps because you had to want to have this question answering capability, right? So I've pulled up a blog post I wrote a while ago, basically kind of talking about this exact topic. And the use case here is super interesting. You're part of some organization. Typically, with any organization, you've got some documents that people should have access to and other documents that they don't. The problem is people don't necessarily know what they should and should not have access to. So they want to ask a question like, what are the sales numbers for Q3 2022? It would sure be nice if I could somehow tell ChatGPT or the LLM, whatever I'm using, some people have access to certain documents, other people don't. So in the ideal case, if the wrong person asks the question, summarize sales numbers, I get the answer, you know what? I can't provide that to you. Sorry about that. A different person asks that question. Hey, you know what? They should be able to ask that question. I want to give them access to it. And, completely transparently, because it's natural language, there's no once you've logged in, all that kind of same information you'd use in a traditional app, it should just work for ChatGPT as well. So it's actually a really interesting problem. I've borrowed a slide that Pamela gave a presentation on a long time ago. When we talk about document search, we typically do this, right? The user asks a question, we search over the corpus, we find relevant documents, and we actually synthesize an answer using the prompt engineering techniques we've talked about in previous videos. So it's kind of a mystery then, how do we actually kind of have access control as part of that? And we're actually going to show you a completely working demo here. So I've pre-run some questions here. I first ask it, what's in my health plan that's not in standard? And you get a response and it makes you wonder, do I have this document in the corpus at all, or do I just not have access to it? One of the challenges of building access control is when we were going through this, sometimes it's hard to tell. It's like, well, do I get this error because I don't know about it or don't have access to it? It's kind of up to you as the application developer. Do I want it to say, I do have documents, but you're not allowed to have them? Typically, what you want to do is you want to pretend like you don't know anything about it at all. So same application, didn't rebuild anything. I asked it once, what's included in my Northwind health plan? I don't know. This is a generic answer. I ask it again and somehow it knows. And how do I do that? Well, if I go in this little developer settings tab here, I've enabled some optional options. There's two relevant ones we're going to talk about today. It's called using authentication and enforcing authentication. So when I enable use authentication, my developer settings changes a lot. I get this huge table. We're going to go over that later, but I get two new options: use OIDS, object identifier security filter, and then use groups. So if I check this OID security filter and I ask it this question, what's included in my Northwind Health Plus plan that's not standard, right? I'm generating the answer. So it's going through these same exact steps that are documented in this blog, but I've added a small piece of authentication. And I now get this chat, hey, based on the provided information, there's no mention. And it's super interesting because it's pulling up these citations that have nothing to do with my question, right? The reason why it's doing this is that we're still doing a search, we're still finding relevant documents, but the LLM is actually reading the documents, providing it, and we're like, the question is just not relevant to the content. I uncheck this little box and I ask it the same exact question, and let's see how it's actually going to change. Suddenly, I get my answer. So clearly, this little box is doing something very interesting because when I uncheck it, I can access all the documents in my corpus. When I check it, I can't. So let's talk a little bit about what this little box does. So just to do a quick review, when we issue this search, we kind of do this by default. We do this hybrid of full text and vector search, and we get the most relevant results here. I'm going to skip down to the bottom. So what we have here by default, when I don't have that box checked, what happens is I've got my app UX, right? This web page. I'm actually running it locally, so that's why you see this local host here. Then we go to the app server, which I'm also running locally, and then we go straight to AI search, right? What I actually want to do, if I want access control, I actually have to change this architecture a bit. So in order to understand why we're adding all these nodes to the app, we need to actually go and talk about our app architecture. So if you've looked at this Azure Search OpenAI demo repo, I go into this app folder, and there's two parts here. There's backend and there's front end. So everything in the front end folder is what I'm actually interacting with here. Everything like the fact that there's a link here, the fact that there's this developer settings tab, it's all defined in this front end package. And the way this front end works, you can see all these files, package.json, tsconfig.json. This is actually what's called a single page application. So when I say this app UX right here, this is actually like its own distinct app, its own identity. It's hosted. It's hosted using app services running in Azure. Right now, I'm running it locally. And if I go to the backend folder, what I'm going to see is I'm going to see this file called app.py. What this is using and Pamela, keep me honest here, it's a fork of Flask called Court.
I wouldn't call it a fork. It's an alternate. It's based off Flask. It's called Court, and one day they might actually get merged together.
Okay, got it. So it's a version of Flask called Court. This is actually where we actually run our server. So I click in this app.py. I'm not gonna go super in depth right now, but you can see there's these bp.roots. So this actually defines how the app works on the back end. So when I represent it in my app architecture, there's actually another representation of something called an eventID app. So we actually need to change the app architecture by inserting these kind of things in the middle. And what these things do, it's called eventID. And what is eventID? If you think about eventID, we're going into basically this concept of identity and access management in Azure. So before we added access control and we were deploying this demo, it didn't have a sense like, yes, there was a connection to Azure where you have an Azure subscription, you're deploying services in there. We had to kind of go a little bit further, and we had to add the concepts of identity and access management. So basically, what is this? It's the idea that we need to ensure the right people, this summarizes it great, the right people, machines, and software components get access to the right resources at the right time. So what we do is we kind of explicitly pull in this idea of an eventID tenant. And these tenants have a trust relationship with subscriptions. If you ever go in the Azure portal and you've ever looked at our bicep template, you might notice us provisioning something called roles. So when we talk about Azure services, we talk about your relationship to Azure services. You as an Azure user have certain rights to access services. For example, I can go in the portal, I can open an AI search service, and I can issue searches to services I own. How is that represented? Well, I, Matt, am a user in eventID. I have a specific role called Search Service Contributor associated with specific search service in my Azure subscription. The subscription doesn't actually manage that. What manages that is the Entra ID tenant. So in order to get access control working, I kind of need to bring forward all the concepts of Entra ID into the app. So I'm a user, right? I have some kind of relationship with my organization. In my case, I work for Microsoft. So I am a user in the Microsoft tenants, right? I could also be using an external social identity provider. If you ever logged into another app through like Facebook or Google, that's called an external social identity provider. And Entra ID is pretty smart. It actually allows you to connect another identity provider that's not part of Entra by default to, so you can log in using another identity. So you can imagine like, hey, my hackathon project, I want to have like social login. The way I would do that is I would actually set up an identity provider through Entra ID. We actually have samples available for that. Unfortunately, we won't be going over that in this talk, but if you're interested, please let us know and we can connect you with those resources. So the next puzzle piece here is authentication. So I am logged in as my identity. So I can log out, right? So if I log out, and it takes a while to log out, I have to actually, to associate my identity, you're going to see up in developer settings, these security filters are grayed out. I have to log in to associate my identity. So this login screen is actually totally customizable in Entra ID. I'm just using a pop-up, but you can like style this page. So like right now there's Contoso demo. For folks that don't know, Contoso is our kind of default. We're doing a demo. What's an organization that's not Microsoft? It's Contoso. So I can log in. I can customize the screen. So I'm logging in as myself. And then I see it here. And now suddenly this table's populated. I'm back on. I can use the security filters. So the next step is authorization. So authentication is just logging in. So there's two distinct, a lot of times it's really easy to kind of put these concepts together. They're two distinct concepts. Authentication is all about, hey, you know what? I am Matt. I work at Microsoft. I should be the only person to be able to log in. Authorization is saying, oh, Matt, when I turn this on, I can ask the question, what happens in a performance review? Why? Because I have access to the documents that talk about performance reviews. He doesn't have access. Sorry, I lost my tab. He does not have access to the documents that talk about benefits. So yes, Matt is allowed to ask questions related to employee handbook. He's not allowed to ask questions about the Northwind Health Plus plan. And that's really important that these are two distinct things. So like imagine Pamela was going to log into this app. Maybe she has access to the benefit documents, but she doesn't get to ask about performance reviews. So we now are introducing this concept because we have authentication and authorization. We can now talk about Matt and Pamela as distinct users who can do different things. And the only way to do this in this demo is to use Entra ID. But we're still not there yet, right? Because we have this diagram at the bottom, right? What are these apps, right? I just made an app, right? I have the front end and the back end folder. Why do I need a separate concept? So it turns out in Entra ID, you actually need to create a representation of your application so it knows about it. So if we go back to our code, if we go to the actual bicep template that provisions this app, we use Azure Developer command line, which makes everything super easy. It's kind of just like a common format for basically saying, you know what, you have a bicep file, but you also have to run some code before and after you provision it. So if I go to my file, it's called azure.yaml. This basically defines the template for how this demo should be deployed. And there's these things called hooks. What do hooks do? They run code before at different points in the provisioning process. So before we provision our demo, we're going to run this auth init script. What does this auth init script do? Well, I go in here. Yes, scripts. I go into auth init. And what does auth init do? It's actually going to be using something called the Microsoft Graph API. So we're now introducing a wholly new API this application needs to use it's called Graph. And basically what it does is it lets you talk to Entra ID programmatically. You can do everything you need to do in the portal, and we have steps on how to manually set that up, but it ends up being kind of complicated to set up due to basically how something called OAuth 2 works. So we've actually written a bunch of code that automatically provisions all the Entra apps for you. And it does it in either the tenant you're provisioning your app in or an optional other tenant because you might not have access to use Entra in the tenant you're provisioning in. Like, for example, in my tenant, the Microsoft tenant, I'm not actually allowed to provision Entra apps that use the permissions I want to use. So I had to provision a separate tenant to do this in. So this script is flexible enough that it can use different tenants. That's totally handled by the script. There's a lot of kind of JSON in the script we're going to talk about later, but know that you run this script before you provision, and then you run this script auth update after you provision. Your authentication should be good to go, and then you can start kind of setting up actually what can the user access. So that's the kind of short part about that. Let's talk about permissions and consent. So there's two general models your application needs to think about when you talk about interacting with Entra. There's the concept of delegated access and app-only access. Delegated access is really useful for what's called impersonation. So in this architecture diagram, there's this app that represents the single page application. We want this app to impersonate the users who's logged in, right? I myself am not actually calling the APIs. The app's calling them on my behalf. And delegated access is exactly what you need in this case. App-only access is really good for things like daemons that run in the background. Like imagine it's like, oh, I'm running a service that's like checking some website automatically. It's not user initiated. That's not actually the model our app uses. We use delegated access. The final piece of the puzzle we need to understand at a high level before we dive in the code is the concept of security tokens. So there's this idea that it's like, I could just create an API that it's like, hey, trust me, I'm Matt, I have access to this, but you have no way of validating that I'm actually who I say I am. Entra handles all of that for you in the background. So we use this concept called token claims. And what are token claims? So when I log in, I'm issued this token, and this token is this kind of bag of JSON. It's like hard to read, interpret, but there's actually APIs we use in the front end to actually unpack this into a set of basically key value pairs called claims. These claims are shipped to everybody that logs into any app that uses what's called OAuth 2. OAuth 2 is a very generic authentication protocol that is pretty much an industry standard for logging in. And it's very useful because it basically describes a common way that all these apps should be logging in and handling security. And so this is an OAuth 2 token that's been unpacked. So if you were to look at a raw token, it would be unreadable. It looks like gibberish. And that's because it's been cryptographically signed by somebody that provides tokens, in this case, Entra. So what we've done here is we've actually unpacked the cryptographic signing, and we're actually looking at the raw data. And there's a lot of kind of confusing fields in here. And we don't actually worry about most of these fields. Like some of these fields, like the ones these are like only to do with security purposes. And we're not super interested in how they work. But if you look at things like, oh, there's a name in here. There's something called OID, object identifier, which is basically a GUID that represents who I am in Entra system, preferred username. So there's a bunch of useful information in these claims I'm actually going to end up using in my app code. So finally, now that we've talked at a high level about what these concepts are, let's talk about actually integrating, right? How do I actually kind of get this box to work? So you'll notice there's something called security filter here. So out of the box, AI search doesn't provide a like quote unquote security feature. What it does is it allows this concept of search filters. So when I actually read my, let me open this in the tab. Okay. So when I actually issue my query, right, my query remains completely the same, but what I need to do is I need to add something called a filter. So when I talk about the idea of filtering, right, the two most common ways organizations like to filter their data is either based on who a user is or what group they're a part of. So there's two, and those options are reflected here. So if I go back to developer settings, I can see I can either check or uncheck this OID, which is basically who am I? And then there's groups, which is basically what groups am I a part of? So if I go back to this image, well, all I do is I basically say, hey, you know what? Collect those who the user is from, and this is really important. I do it from the token claims because I can trust the token claims because it's from Entra. You can't just call this API and say, hey, pretend I'm Matt, pretend to be Pamela. Like I have to actually be logged in as her, and we have cryptographic ways of verifying that. So because I'm using the token claims, it's safe. And I use this information from the token claims. Hey, this guy is who he says he is. I'm going to add this to the filter. So the way this is actually implemented on the back end, and there's actually code in here. If I go to app, I go to the back end, I go to core, I go to authentication.py. So there's actually a helper method here, which is basically, it's called build security filters. And it actually takes the claims in that have already been, so the same table that I see, I'm going to pack it up as a Python dictionary. And I'm literally just going to say, hey, get this claim out of the token and put it in this filter of searching, basically saying, I want to search over all the documents, but only pick the documents that are associated with this user. So that's kind of the magic of how these, and the groups works the same way. There just could be more than one group. So how can I actually change this, right? I now have changed my mind. And you know what? I thought about it. It's kind of weird that Pamela is allowed to ask questions of benefits and Matt's not. So how can I actually give myself access? Well, there's a bunch of handy scripts called manage ACLs. The parameters are kind of a bear to set up, but I've preset them up where basically I'm going to now add the access document, the access control. I'm going to edit that and I'm going to give myself access to this document. So right now, I'm not allowed to ask this question, but I just gave myself access. I'm going to ask the same question, and I didn't recompile the app or anything. All I did was change the search service. I just ran a script that basically said, "Hey, given that document benefit options, which answers this question, give Matt access." And now even when I check the OID security filter, I can now ask that question. Changed my mind. You know what? Matt shouldn't be able to ask these questions. He's not allowed to have benefits. We're going to take them away. You know what? Just hide it from him. He's not allowed. He doesn't even know what the benefits are. So let's remove that access. And I'm going to keep that box checked. I'm going to ask the same exact question. And I am still installing my dependencies. So Matt is still allowed to ask. He asked it in time before the virtual environment got set up. So he had a grace period, but he's not going to have access for long. Yeah, he's not allowed to ask anymore. See, I updated the search index, so he's not allowed to have benefits anymore. Sorry, Matt. So how does this actually work, right? Because that's kind of cool. I can just like take access and give it away. Well, it's actually really simpler than you might think because we're just updating a record in the search service. So if I actually go to this manage ACL script, it takes 3 parameters. And literally all it does is it just uses this API called merge documents. So in Azure AI Search, there's this API that lets you update documents, and there's an action called merge. And what merge does is it basically says, you know what? You have a lot of fields in your document, right? I've got my chunk, I got my vector. That's a lot to update. I don't really want to update all those things at once. I just want to update the access control and leave everything else alone. I use this merge documents API, and all I do is I just say, hey, you know what? Take that list of people who are allowed to access it. Why don't you add Matt? And the code to do that is all here. So you could use this script. You could copy paste that code and use it in your own app. So thought about it, and you know what? This seems really insecure because I can just uncheck this box and now I can have access to my benefits again. I don't want Matt to have access to the benefits. So there's a bunch of environment variables that change how authentication works in this demo. So let's take a quick detour and actually look at them. So if I go to the bottom of this documentation, it says setting up optional access control. So the vast majority of this documentation has to do with manual setup, which we don't need to worry about that now that we have automation for it. But environment variable reference is super nice because there's a lot of variables here that we need to worry about that most of them are automatically set up for you, but there's two that you really need to care about using this demo. There's the idea of enabling authentication at all, which is this Azure User Authentication. So if I want to remove the ability for users to see everything in the index, it's like, guess what? You're forced to use authentication. We're not going to give you that little checkbox to get out of jail. There's this environment variable called Azure Enforce Access Control. And when I set that variable here, etd, I set it to false for this demo, but I can set it to true. And I'm going to restart this. So while this is restarting, it takes a bit. I'm going to go over these tables. So there's a bunch of different environments you can run this demo in, right? So by default, I run AZD up. It goes to app services. So if I enable authentication but disable enforce access control, you know what? I'm going to actually use something called Easy Auth by default. And what Easy Auth does is it's kind of our one-stop shop in app services for adding authentication and a login page to your app. So everything gets put behind a login page. You don't worry about it. There's some integration code in the front end that makes the access control work with it, but it's very small. Basically, Easy Auth does most of the work for you. You get free login page getting your app. So guess what? Random people, they're not allowed to use your question asking app. So you ever thought to yourself, hey, I'm just putting an unsecured endpoint on the internet. Anybody can use my LLM. You can easily restrict that by adding Easy Auth. We've got sample code in here. So go lock down your apps so that people don't start using all your tokens and you just have to pay a bunch of money. That would be really bad. So highly recommend when you deploy this for real in production, you have a login page gating it because let's face it, this is not cheap to use. If I, as a bonus, add enforcing access control, now everybody's forced to use access control. The only downside of that is you have to now make sure you've updated access control on every single document so that people can actually ask questions. So it's kind of a big step, but the advantage of enabling access control is I'm putting sales data in there. Maybe everybody should not be allowed access to that. Now we do support deploying to code spaces and local, and we've gone ahead and filled out what the behavior is for each of these. So feel free to deploy wherever, test wherever. We've spent a lot of time making sure you can still run locally with authentication. That is a kind of common problem sometimes that it's like, oh, I can't test this locally. I have to deploy it's super annoying. It's actually super easy to run this like I'm running it locally with authentication. I've rebooted, and now guess what? This checkbox is checked. I can't uncheck it. I want to know what a product manager does. I'm not allowed to ask that question, so I'm not going to get an answer. And there's no get out of jail card. I can't uncheck this. I can't hack it either because the actual API itself. Let me pull up the code. We're using a very clever thing Pamela actually taught me about. It's called decorators. And what decorators do is they are kind of like a function you run before your function. So you'll notice I put this little decorator here called authenticated. This is actually a different one. Let me do this one, authenticated. So I want to ask a question. So you know what? Chat's not giving me the answer I want. I think I can hack this. I'm going to go to a different API. I'm going to ask the same question. Maybe it'll let me through. But it doesn't because I applied this authenticated decorator to this root. What does this decorator do? What's the kind of secret magic that makes it authenticated? Well, there's a decorators.py. I go in here. Super easy to make a decorator in Quart. I just do this @wraps thing. So what I do is I pull my we have a class. I briefly touched on this code earlier. It's an authentication.py, and I basically say, hey, you know what? Get the claims, and if they're not logged in, give them a 403. In my case, I am logged in, so I'm going to log out. The front end actually stops you from asking a question here, but I can still ask a question by clicking this. So, and I get we got to fix that bug actually. So, but if I log in, I don't have access to it. So, basically the point is that I return a 403. So it doesn't even let me ask the question when I'm not logged in. So It's super easy to add an authenticated path. Just add a decorator. We've pre-written one for you. So it's super easy to add authentication. You can use our scripts to set up the apps. Let's briefly talk about how the apps work. Unfortunately, Entra ID can be difficult to use. So I've tried to document the flow here of how this actually works. So if we go back to our authentication diagram, there's two apps here. There's a single page app and there's a server app. Now, you don't have to set up your app like this, but that's how the demo is set up. So we wanted to show a demo of it working with the app. So in order to use anything related to OAuth 2, so kind of moving Entra aside, we need to use the concept of something called an OAuth flow. An OAuth flow is basically a way you log in and like use the security features of OAuth 2. It's kind of the whole thing. So here's a great example. So I wanted to watch Netflix last night. Well, Netflix has changed their policy and they're very aggressively expiring tokens because they don't want people to be like, I logged in like a year ago using my mom's password. I get free Netflix, right? So no, they're aggressively expiring tokens now. So they make sure you log in more often. Well, I log in and I get hit with on the TV. It's like, well, I could type in my password using my remote. That's kind of hard. I could also take a picture of a QR code and go through a little nice web dialog. That's what's called an OAuth flow. This flow applies to any situation, anytime you log into anything ever. That's just one example. Like we have to deal with OAuth flows as well. So in a single page flow, you see this dialog that pops up when I log out. So I log in. I was already logged in, so I kind of skipped it. But that's a flow. That's basically acquiring the token when you already have one cached. If I log in and I see a keypad, that's a flow. That's a different type. So the specific flow we use here is because there's multiple applications involved. We unfortunately use one of the most complicated flows out there. It's called on behalf of. On behalf of says what it does on the box. I am accessing a resource, the Microsoft Graph API, on behalf of another application. So the server needs to access this on behalf of, hey, I logged into the single page application. I want to pass that logging in onto the server application. So, well, when I log in, I use an authentication code. This is your kind of default flow. The other most common one is called device code. Imagine I'm like on a Raspberry Pi. I don't have a web UI. I just have a CLI. You might see this when you log into Visual Studio. It pops up a little message saying, oh, copy paste this code and put it in your web browser. That's the device code flow. Pros of device code flow is you can use it without a UI. Downside is kind of more technical. Authentication code is kind of your default. Anybody can use it. It's the Netflix flow I was talking about earlier. So I get a token back that says, oh, you are who you say you are. Then what I need to do is I need to pass that on to the API server. So when I call my endpoint, let's go back and let's look at this decorator a little bit more closely. So I showed the decorator on the surface. Let's actually look at the code of the decorator a little bit more in depth. So if you look at this code here, we're calling this get auth claims if enabled. And I wonder if I can do this code search. Yes. Okay. So what am I doing here? I get the token out of the header. And I get the token out of the header. So there's this, typically when you pass a token, you have an API, you pass an HTTP header called authorization. What does this authorization header do? It has something in the body of the header. I am using a token. So I am using a scheme called the bearer token, which means this API is bearing some kind of authentication. So I parse out, I basically says bearer, and then there's a bunch of JSON encrypted mess. I basically need to decode that. There's a slightly different header we use with easy auth. Again, all the code that makes this work with easy auth and just out of the box local auth is there for you. So feel free to copy paste it or use it. So once we've done that, we've authenticated to the API server, and we actually execute a flow here. We basically say, hey, acquire token on behalf of. And this actually runs through the on behalf of flow. It's unfortunately at a low level, kind of hard to understand, but there's this library we use called MSAL, which is Microsoft Authentication Library, that does all the lower level OAuth 2 stuff for us. So all we worry about is passing on the token we got from the user's API. And then we pass it with something called scopes. Scopes and OAuth are basically saying what you need. So in my case, I am saying, hey, I need access to the Graph API to call some APIs. So I get certain token claims in the token. Remember how I said we can trust stuff in the token because it's cryptographically signed? Well, unfortunately, that's only part of the story. So very common in organizations, like in Microsoft, I'm part of literally thousands of groups. I don't even know what my group memberships are. And if I'm going to use groups to kind of say, hey, here's how I secure access to my app, I'd better be able to get all those groups. And even though we can efficiently search them, they're not going to be in the token because the token basically has something called an overage claim, which basically means you're part of way too many groups. I give up. I'm not going to include them in the token. So how do I fix that? Well, there's an API in the graph that lets me list all the groups I'm a part of. So I run through this fancy on behalf of flow. I call the list groups API and I unpack all those groups and I'm good to go. So that's in a nutshell how the auth lower level part works. If you're super curious about the nitty gritty details, this file is a really good one to go through, authentication.py. But that's kind of how the on behalf of flow works at a lower level. And then we kind of forward that on to access control. Now, there's one more helper script you might be interested in. Sounds kind of tedious to populate all this access control myself. How can I do it in a more automated way? So, sorry, 1 second. So what happens when I have a bunch of authentication data in my data source? Well, in our handy prep docs Swiss Army knife of data ingestion, we have a tool that lets you use Azure Storage. In particular, Data Lake Storage Gen 2 has the ability, basically you have regular blob storage. You can actually associate users and groups from Entra with individual blobs and folders. So we have a bunch of helper scripts for kind of reading this information and building it into your search index. So you don't need to do that manually. We have documentation on how to use that in this login and ACL setup. So you have a choice of kind of basically saying, hey, I can use Data Lake as my source of authentication truth, or I can just, you know what, let me handle it myself, and you can just use the scripts and manually set it up. The manual setup is super useful if you don't have the access control information handy, and I just need to maybe restrict a couple people from this document. So yeah, that's most of the content I had. Wanted to open it up for any questions from the audience. I know this is a ton of content. Hopefully all the kind of scripts and scaffolding we've written makes implementing this a bit easier for you.
All right. Thank you, Matt. I learn a little bit more Entra every time. I have to like rewatch it, keep learning. So we do have some great questions. Just like a general question overall about OIDs versus groups. How do we reason about which ones to use?
That's a great question. These are the two most common ways organizations that use Entra want to filter things in general. So use OIDs if you're like, hey, you know what? This user should only have access to this. Use groups if you're like, you know what? I have so many users. I don't want to be manually messing with them. If they're in this group, they have access to this document. So that's kind of how I think about using groups versus OID. And now in this demo, it's much easier to demo this with just a user ID in general, because adding and removing groups from Entra takes time to propagate, whereas users like you are who you are, and you can't really change that. So sometimes with groups, if you're like messing, like, oh, I want to add this guy to this group and see if he has access, it takes some time to propagate, so it might not immediately show up. So users in general is easier to test, but groups is easier to manage for large amounts of people.
And can you use both of them?
Yes. So the filter code that is available in authentication.py shows you how to combine those together. So if I go to core authentication, you're going to see like I am literally just using the OData filter syntax. So basically, oh, I've lost it. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. So I actually combine these with an or. So I have to either match one or the other. And if I have enforced access control, I'm using both of these. It looks from the code like you have an option, but effectively, you'll see like, hey, required access control doesn't matter what the overrides are, enforce it.
Mm,
So it's
okay.
literally just adding a filter to your search query. And as a side note, AI search is really good at efficiently running these filters. We have specific functionality built in for this use case where it's like, there's 10,000 groups in the query. What do I do? It can do that no problem because we're using a feature called search.in, which is specifically optimized for large amounts of GUIDs and large strings. So don't worry about like performance with this approach. It should be just fine.
Awesome. Okay, so some specific questions from V. Kessel. Would so this one is, would you use OIDs or groups for deployment on B2C?
Great question. B2C groups aren't as relevant because you have random people signing it, unless you have some kind of
Mhm.
setup. If I was using B2C, believe it's been rebranded to something else. Don't quote me on that. Entra has kind of gone through a lot of name changes, but in a consumer scenario, the typical use case is individual users. Now, you might have a different case because, like, hey, I'm building a RAG app. I want to do something like the assistance API. Uh, Typically with that model, you're basically a user as a tenant. So I would use the OID method to kind of say, oh, they can only see their documents. And I do that through the security. So this is kind of a easy way to implement that type of modeling. So access control, thanks for reminding me actually, because it's like I'm using the consumer facing, oh, I'm going to make a competitor to custom GPTs. I would want to use the access control method with OIDs. That's the thing that makes the most sense. Now, OIDs and B2C work just great. There is one thing you should note. Let's say I log in my Google account and I log in my Facebook account. I'm actually going to have a different OID. So you're going to have some logic that like merges different social logins if you that matters to you. But you might have observed this. It's like, let's say I'm logging into like, I don't know, a pizza ordering app. I use the social login. It's like, I logged in with Facebook this time. I logged in with Google before. I don't have my history. That's because you have different OIDs in those cases. So apps that handle merging social logins, like that's not out of the box, I don't think. So that's just something to note if you are using a consumer solution. In an enterprise
Okay.
solution, you typically don't have that problem because you only have one identity. In a social,
Mhm.
you might have multiple identities associated with the same person.
Yeah, I have multiple identities. We have another question about, is it better to use B2B Entra? I don't know if it's Entra or Entra ID or Azure B2C.
They are now the same thing. So I think it's moot. So
Okay.
B2B is for an enterprise scenario, B2C is a different scenario completely. B2C is, hey, I'm advertising to consumers that are not part of my organization. B2B is, oh, it's internal or I'm talking to other businesses. So which intro you use depends on your scenario. How do I get OIDs? I just unpack it from the claim. So we have code in here. So I'm actually going to point you to the front ends that like actually literally has the pretty, there's a component in here, which you might want to check out. It's called token claims display. And it literally shows you how to unpack it just literally unpacks the claims from a token. It's super easy. It's just unpacking JSON. We also have the same code in Python in core authentication.py. So there's the get auth claims. So we literally have this kind of code that all it does is it just says it just literally accesses the dictionary. So if you're using Microsoft Authentication Library, it's as simple as accessing a dictionary. I literally just pull the ID token claims out. Uh, Now, a word of caution. Uh, this has totally happened before. Before you use the access token, you got to validate it. We actually made this mistake in the repo at first, but we were basically cheating by running through the flow first. You don't want to cheat because what's happened in the past, and this has happened to other organizations too, they don't validate the access token when they get it. Uh, OAuth tokens, unfortunately, can be forged. The forgery can be detected, but only if you validate it. We have code built in, you can copy paste that validates the token. You always want to do that because unfortunately people are clever and they want to forge these. Forged tokens can be easily detected. You just have to copy paste the code. So if you are going to grab the OID out of the claims, always validate it first. And then you can trust it because then you know it's not forged. But it's as simple as a dictionary access, and feel free to copy paste some code here that does. It's a lot of boilerplate, unfortunately. We are anticipating a better solution sometime in 2025. Wish I had better news, but this sadly, there's a lot of boilerplate that needs to be copy pasted until then. Sorry about that.
Yeah, but luckily it's now in our repo, so
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
use the repo.
Uh-huh.
If you're trying to get the OID of a user who's not logged in, because you're trying to like manage your ACLs, like how does an admin generally find out the OIDs of the people in their org? You just go into the portal and you kind of
Yeah. So if you're an admin, you can look in the portal because you basically have a user's view. And like I can look for the documentation now. We can send it later, but there's literally like a Entra ID portal documentation. There's a users tab, and you can just search for the user. I have not tried this in the B2C scenario, so I don't know. Like I would imagine you'd want to be more automated when it comes to the B2C. So it's like I'm building an app. Only users should have access to only their documents. Like
right.
just use the approach, like grab the OID and then any docs they upload, just associate the OID with that.
Hmm.
The B2B approach, messing with the portal makes more sense because it's like, that's my organization. B2C, like I said, people might have multiple identities. It's complicated. It's probably going to be a lot of like weird, like things you might not like, people you don't know. So use the portal approach if you're in a B2B scenario. I would kind of be more cautious about that in a B2C environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think a really common variation on this app is B2C, where the user uploads their own documents. And when they do that upload, you grab the OID from the claim, you associate their document in the blob storage or whatever with that OID or maybe in data lake, and then make sure that going forward they can only filter on that.
Yeah. You,
Uh,
and you're also free if you use your own upload scripts to just copy paste that managed. Like you can look, it's literally just another column in your document. So when you upload the document, just make sure to include the OID in there.
Yeah. Okay, we got some more great questions. All right. So in a B2B situation, should you be including this at the very beginning of your development? Should the docs always be access limited? What if you're in early stages, you're just building prototype?
Great question. So obviously, access control makes everything more complicated, right? I'm not going to lie. Like you probably saw how long those scripts were. Uh, in my opinion, it is something that should be done before production. You don't have to start with it. The only catch is if you're developing a B2C type application where you have to be logged in to use it, it might make more sense. But in a B2B, where like, oh, everybody has access to everything, uh, it is harder to add. Now, we have made it a lot easier by doing a bunch of this work for you. So is it really more difficult because we have a local development solution with auth working? You have the option to do it earlier. So I would recommend trying to see if our approach works for you because you can just copy paste a lot of our boilerplate. It might make more sense now. I would have had a different answer before this because yes, it's hard to use.
And so following up on the BTC question, Maruf asks if we were to if we I guess were to add B2C support to the repository, would it require a significant number of changes in the authentication section? And do we have plans to include it by default?
This is great feedback. This is something that I am more than happy to assist with. And like we can talk over the GitHub issues. We actually had another person in Microsoft figure out how to set up B2C, which unfortunately there's more steps. So I am more than happy to help pull in his changes as optional. So we've already had a lot of that work done for us. So the answer is yes, it's more complicated to set up B2C, but the positive is we have a sample we can now integrate with, and more than happy to make that change. Please feel free to file an issue about this and tag me and Pamela, and we can talk about it.
Yeah, so I guess that must be the change that that James made to my other repo that
Yes.
adds B2C. Is that right? Okay. I didn't appreciate that that's actually B2C. So yeah, there is another repo that I have that's a very simple app that he added B2C to, which makes sense because that's a situation where you more likely want B2C. So we just have to merge bring in the changes that we don't have to specifically support B2C. So please do file an issue about that. We love having reasons to improve things. All right, we have a question, another question from Andrej. Is it possible to add APIM, which is API management? So is it possible to add APIM service and handle authentication and authorization over there?
So the short answer is it should totally be possible. The place you would add that is in the roots as a decorator, probably. I am not personally super familiar with APIM. I don't know if you are, Pamela, but again, like please feel free to file an issue and we can talk about it. I think the more options for authentication, because like there's a lot of different scenarios, it would be very useful to at least have something that people can use as boilerplate. We currently only support the B2B scenario. Like adding B2C makes sense. I don't know a lot about APIM, but like love to learn more about
Yeah, I know we definitely have a lot of folks who are using APIM. A lot of the people using it are using it actually for load balancing their OpenAI instances. And there's actually a separate repo that can handle that you can just use in conjunction with this. So if you're scaling to really big usage, then or even not that huge actually, you may start needing load balancing across OpenAI instances because they have limited capacity. And there you can use APIM to do this kind of smart load balancing based off of token limits and retries and stuff. But I think some folks have also used it for authentication. APIM does, cost some amount of money, so I think a lot of folks who are using APIM are using it maybe for multiple things, so that they can really benefit from investing in that cost. So I think there's already an issue in the repo about APIM where I just ask people what they're using it for. So that's a great place to say, hey, has anybody used this for authentication, just to get some tips for them? Because I bet you some folks in that thread have already used it for authentication and can talk about how they did that. Great questions. Okay, I think we have covered all the questions here. Really good questions and feedback. And yeah, so I think we can, let's see, if we can wrap up this session. If you can bring up, there we go. All right. So thank you so much, Matt. We all learned a lot. Even though I reviewed that code, I still learned a lot from having you go through it because there's just so much to learn in the authentication and authorization space. So every time learn a little bit more. So those of you watching, if you haven't yet, please do sign up for the hackathon and submit your hacks. Submissions will be due pretty soon now, like in about a week or so. And there is a link from the README for how to submit. There are 4 prizes and they're each $500, just cash, because cash is best. And there's prizes for, like, I think, what do we got? We got best overall. We've got best community helper for those of you who are helping out in the discussion forums and the stream comments. We've got best in your own language, and we've got one more too. So check out the repo for more information about the prizes and for submission. And and hopefully some of you have already started hacking. It's not too late to start. You can see how to deploy for free at this akka here, akka.ms/ragchat/free. You can go through all of our previous recordings, and please attend the rest of the recordings this week and post in the forum if you have any issues or questions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt.
it. Thanks for having me.